He stepped onto the aircraft with a steady gait, leaning gently on a cane, and wearing nothing but a quiet smile. No designer labels, no booming voice, just a soft, unshakable presence. But almost immediately, the lead flight attendant halted him in his tracks. Her tone was clipped, her expression unreadable, as she examined his boarding pass. She asked for identification, questioned its authenticity, and treated him like someone who had somehow wandered into the wrong section of the plane. Around him, first-class passengers watched in silence, some with confusion, some with judgment, none with courage. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man she had just embarrassed wasn't just a retired judge. He also happened to be one of the quiet investors who held shares in the very airline she worked for. And this flight, what started as just another routine route, was about to become something unforgettable. He moved slowly toward the boarding gate, a small weathered leather bag in one hand and his boarding pass in the other. His name was Justice Ellison Grant, though hardly anyone at the bustling Brighton Metropolitan Airport recognized him. His steps were measured, steady. His cane, made of polished walnut, had been with him since the accident that changed his life nearly a decade earlier. His overcoat was clean but understated, his shoes well-shined but plain. Everything about him spoke of dignity without pretense. He didn't flaunt wealth, power, or status. He moved through space with quiet confidence, the kind earned through decades of experience. Most people didn't look twice, and that was exactly how Ellison preferred it. At the gate, he handed over his boarding pass to a young airline agent named Devon Tran. The boy barely looked up, scanned the pass with a bored beep, and nodded with a neutral smile. "You're all set, sir. Have a great flight." Ellison responded with a polite nod and proceeded down the jet bridge. It was a short domestic flight, nothing dramatic. And after 30 years on the federal bench, Ellison Grant had grown fond of the simple things, like quiet skies and uninterrupted journeys. At the aircraft door, a tall woman stood with her arms neatly clasped in front of her. Her name was Clara, and she was the lead flight attendant. In her early 40s, Clara had sharp eyes and a tighter smile. Her uniform was flawless, her posture crisp with control. She greeted Ellison with a professional, if slightly strained, smile. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your boarding pass?" He handed it over without question. She glanced down at the seat assignment, then up at his face. The polite smile faded from her lips, replaced by a small furrow between her brows. She returned the boarding pass, but didn't move aside. "And your ID, please," she added. Ellison raised a single brow. "You've already seen my boarding pass." "Yes," she said, the courtesy still there, but now tinged with ice. "But I need to verify your identification as well." A few nearby passengers stirred, sensing tension, but saying nothing. With calm precision, Ellison reached into the inner pocket of his coat and presented his ID. Clara studied it longer than necessary, then looked back at him. "This doesn't match what I was expecting," she said slowly. "Where did you get this ticket?" He kept his voice steady. "I purchased it online, like everyone else." Clara's hesitation hung in the air. Then, in clipped words, she said, "Please step aside, sir. I need to verify this with the gate staff." Without resistance, Ellison complied. He stood quietly just past the threshold, his posture composed as passengers filed in behind him. Some looked at him with curiosity. Others averted their gaze entirely. No one spoke. Clara turned and made a hushed call on the cabin phone, her voice urgent but low. Her face remained tight, clearly convinced something about him didn't fit. Minutes later, a ground supervisor arrived, Caleb Rios, a tall, tired-looking man with a clipboard under one arm and a Bluetooth earpiece in place. He took the ID from Clara, gave Ellison a brief glance, and pulled out his phone. A short call followed. His demeanor shifted halfway through the conversation. The tone of his voice changed. He ended the call, looked directly at Clara, and said in a firm voice, "He's cleared. Let him take his seat." Clara blinked. "But I thought—" "You thought wrong," Caleb interrupted quietly. "He's good to go." Without waiting for another word, Clara stepped aside. Ellison gave her a small nod, not angry, not smug, simply detached, and began his slow walk down the aisle. He found his seat in first class, tucked his cane neatly beside him, and sat. No one welcomed him. Clara didn't apologize. The passengers around him stared at their screens or out the window. Silence filled the space like fog, dense, awkward, and revealing. He fastened his seatbelt quietly, leaning back against the soft leather. The lights in the cabin were warm and dim, but he didn't feel comforted. His thoughts lingered on what had just happened. His thoughts lingered on what had just occurred. It wasn't new. Not to him. Encounters like this had followed him through the years. People questioning, hesitating, assuming he didn't belong. Not because of anything he did. Just because he didn't look the way they expected someone in his position to look. Ellison Grant had endured far worse in courtrooms filled with tension and prejudice. But this still carried a sting. It wasn't the words that cut deep. It was the eyes, the tone, the unspoken judgment. Down the aisle, Clara Maddox moved through first class, offering drinks with her trained smile, perfect posture, and calm tone. But when she reached Ellison's row, she simply skipped past him. No glance, no acknowledgement, no offer of water or menu, as though pretending he didn't exist might erase what had happened at the door. Ellison didn't react. He simply folded his hands in his lap and stared out the window. The sky was still a brilliant blue, the runway stretching wide and long beneath them. But inside the cabin, the silence around him had weight. 2 rows ahead, a man in a navy blazer leaned sideways and whispered something to the woman beside him. They both cast quick glances back toward Ellison, then turned away when he noticed. He could feel their discomfort, how badly they wanted to look without being caught. He didn't hold it against them. He was used to being judged. But something about today felt different. His phone buzzed softly in his inner jacket pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Victor Saleh, his longtime business partner and one of his closest friends. Just landed in Albany. "Everything's in place for the board meeting. Call me after you touch down." Ellison typed a brief reply. Held at the gate. Got questioned again. "I'm fine." A few seconds later, Victor's response came in. "Same old thing. Don't let it slide this time. People forget. Some need reminding." Ellison stared at those last words for a moment, letting them settle in. Then he tucked the phone away, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The cabin had nearly filled up. The last passengers were just getting seated. At the front of the plane, Clara whispered something to a junior flight attendant named Anya Patel. Anya glanced back toward Ellison's row, then quickly averted her eyes. Clara handed her a stack of laminated first-class menus and headed toward the galley, never sparing Ellison another look. He opened his eyes and watched the way the crew moved around him. Not with respect, but with unease. Like his presence made them unsure, like they didn't know what to say. Or worse, didn't want to say anything at all. No one dared acknowledge what had happened. But he could feel it, thick in the air, invisible and dense. The kind of silence that said everything, and Ellison knew something they didn't. Clara Maddox had made a mistake, one that would cost more than she expected. And the flight hadn't even left the ground yet. The engines roared softly beneath the floor as the plane began to taxi. Still, Ellison remained still, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him. The hum of the aircraft couldn't drown out the chill around him. No welcome, no menu, not even a basic glass of water. Clara had returned to treating him as if he were invisible, as though the earlier moment could be buried beneath a few polite smiles and stiff routines. But Ellison had lived long enough to know. Ignoring a mistake doesn't erase it. It just delays its echo. Anya moved softly down the aisle, her footsteps light. Her eyes lowered as she passed Ellison. She paused a few seats ahead to serve drinks to a couple who had been watching the earlier scene with visible interest. Ellison noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured sparkling water into a glass. She hadn't spoken to him either, but at least her silence didn't feel like Clara's. It wasn't laced with superiority. It was hesitation, nervousness, maybe even guilt. Then the captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've been cleared for takeoff. Please fasten your seatbelts and switch all electronic devices to airplane mode. Thank you for flying with North Bay Air today." The aircraft turned slowly onto the runway and began to accelerate. Ellison closed his eyes again. That first lift of the plane, it always carried the same sensations. The faint drop in the stomach, the pressure building in his ears, and that brief moment of weightlessness before the aircraft steadied. He had taken hundreds of flights in his life. But each time, he was reminded just how small the world could feel when you were surrounded by people who refused to see you. The seatbelt sign turned off. Clara reappeared at the front of the cabin, her polished smile back in place. She moved efficiently through the rows, checking seat preferences, calling passengers by name, offering champagne and juice. But when she reached Ellison's row, she slowed her pace as if she might stop, but then continued walking without a word. No drink, no glance, no service. This was no accident. This was deliberate. A quiet punishment, one she hoped would be invisible. But across the aisle, someone noticed. A middle-aged man in a charcoal gray sweater and smart glasses, a tech executive named Reed Maher, leaned slightly toward Ellison. "She didn't offer you anything," Reed said softly. Ellison turned his head and replied simply, "No, she didn't." "No," Reed Maher said softly, looking uneasy. "She didn't." Ellison gave him a faint smile. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't mocking. Just steady, grounded. "It's not right," he said simply. Reed looked away, unsure of how to respond. Like most people in that cabin, he wasn't used to walking into uncomfortable truths. It was easier to notice quietly than to speak out and become part of the story. Ellison picked up his phone again and scrolled past Victor Sala's earlier messages. He opened another thread, this one with Darren Wells, an executive at the airline and one of the few people who could actually make things happen. He typed, "Flight staff problem. Made me wait. Didn't believe my ticket. No apology. Now I'm being ignored." A moment passed. Then the reply came. "Flight number?" Ellison responded without delay. "NB42, first class." There was no answer after that, but he didn't need one. He placed the phone on the tray table in front of him and leaned back, his hands folded calmly in his lap. The flight was scheduled for just an hour and 40 minutes, but something told him it would feel much longer for someone else on board. Up in the galley, Clara Maddox leaned against the counter, sipping from a paper cup, her posture straight as ever, but her fingers tapped restlessly against the silver tray beside her. She knew she had overstepped when she stopped that man from boarding. What she hadn't expected was to be challenged, especially by the ground crew. It embarrassed her, not because of what she'd done, but because someone had undone it. She didn't understand how someone like him had gotten a first-class seat. She had worked this route long enough. She knew the usual passengers, their faces, their mannerisms. And Ellison Grant didn't fit the mold. Nearby, Anya Patel arranged menus and water cups, trying to stay occupied, to stay unnoticed. She glanced at Clara, then lowered her eyes again. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. "You sure he wasn't supposed to be in business class?" Clara shook her head, still watching the cockpit door. "I've worked this airline for 14 years. I know who usually flies up here." Anya hesitated, but his name was on the manifest. Clara rolled her eyes. These things get mixed up all the time. Maybe someone gifted him the seat, or he pulled strings. Either way, something felt off. Before Anya could say anything more, the intercom buzzed. Clara turned and picked it up. Lead Maddox speaking. The voice on the other end was low and direct. Her face paled. Now, the voice replied with a firm tone. She swallowed. Understood. She hung up and stood still for a beat. Her jaw tightened, her shoulders stiffened. Then, without a word, she straightened her jacket and made her way toward the cockpit. The captain was already waiting and stepped aside to let her in. Inside the small cabin, the co-pilot nodded politely. But neither of them spoke. Instead, the small screen for satellite communication lit up, and on it appeared the face of Marcus Lynn, the director of airline operations. He wasn't smiling. "Clara," he said evenly. His voice was calm, but it carried an edge. "We've received a direct call from the boardroom. There's a problem on your flight." She stood straighter, trying to mask the pressure building behind her ribs. "What kind of problem, sir?" "A formal complaint. First-class passenger. Detained at the gate. Asked for ID. Told he didn't look like he belonged." Her expression barely shifted. "Sir, I followed protocol. His ID didn't match what I expected. I was being careful." Marcus's eyes didn't blink. "That man," he said slowly, "is Justice Ellison Grant." Clara blinked once. Marcus continued. "The same Ellison Grant who served on the East Coast Court of Appeals for 28 years. The same man who now sits on our airline's advisory board. The same man who holds equity in this company." Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "You didn't recognize him?" "Fine," Marcus said. "But you assumed he didn't belong. That is not fine. And now he's been sitting in first class for over half an hour. No drink, no service, while you've walked past him like he wasn't even there." I didn't know," she said quietly. "You will go to him," Marcus said. "Now. And you will apologize, not quietly. I want everyone in that cabin to hear it. You will serve him directly for the rest of the flight. No more games." Clara nodded stiffly, her throat dry. "Yes, sir." Marcus's voice dropped lower. "And when that plane lands, you'll be reporting to the board. Do you understand?" She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." The screen went black. For a long second, the cockpit was still. The captain looked at her, his expression unreadable. Clara turned and exited, her steps slower now, heavier. Her confidence, so tightly held just minutes ago, had cracked. She reached the curtain separating first class from the galley and paused. That same cold silence she had given Ellison Grant earlier was now pressing down on her. Only this time, there was no shield to hide behind. She stepped through the curtain. Her heart beat loudly in her chest. Each row she passed felt longer than it should have. Every pair of eyes, even the ones pretending to stare at magazines, felt like they were watching her now. For years, she had walked confidently through first-class cabins like she ran them. But not today. Today, every step felt like judgment. She had spent years moving confidently through first-class cabins as though she owned them. Clara Maddox had always been respected, rarely questioned, but not today. Today, her steps felt heavier. Her breath caught in her throat. Her thoughts raced, chaotic and tangled, but one thing echoed clearly in her mind. He owns part of this airline. She had never imagined that the man she dismissed so quickly could hold so much power. Justice Ellison Grant was seated exactly where she had left him, composed, still unreadable. A folded newspaper rested neatly on his tray table. His cane stood beside him like a quiet witness. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he'd heard her steps. Of course he had. He knew what was coming. She stopped at his row, her palms damp, her mouth dry. All around them, passengers shifted in their seats, pretending to read or scroll, but every ear was tuned in. Across the aisle, Reed Maher glanced over, then looked away just as quickly. A woman 2 rows back quietly removed her headphones. The tension was thick and growing. Clara crouched slightly, lowering herself to meet Ellison at eye level. Her voice was low, but not low enough to be missed. "Mr. Grant," she began, forcing the words out, "I'd like to apologize for earlier. There was a misunderstanding during boarding. I shouldn't have questioned your credentials." Ellison finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. They were calm, measured, but distant, like he was weighing every syllable in the air between them. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. Clara nodded quickly. "Yes, I didn't recognize your name. I wanted to be careful with the manifest." He let the silence stretch between them, then said, "You didn't ask anyone else in this cabin for ID." Her lips parted, but no words came. "You asked me," he continued, voice quiet but pointed. "In front of everyone. You asked for more proof than anyone else. You made me wait while others boarded." Around them, passengers froze, caught between their screens, and the truth now being spoken aloud. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "I didn't mean to offend you," she whispered. "It wasn't personal." "But it was," Ellison said evenly. "That's the problem." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed with more weight than a shout ever could. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't know my background, my name, my role, but you saw me and decided something about me." Clara's face flushed. The truth hung there, between them, undeniable now. She didn't say the words, "You don't look like you belong here," but she didn't have to. It had been in her posture, her tone, her hesitation. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time more quietly. "I'll make sure you're properly served for the rest of the flight." Ellison didn't respond. Instead, he returned his gaze to the newspaper and unfolded it slowly. That simple act, his silence, spoke louder than anything else could have. Clara rose to her feet and turned toward the galley, her composure slipping with every step. This time, she could feel the eyes, the shift in atmosphere. The passengers who once looked away now watched closely. Some embarrassed, others curious, a few exchanging whispers now that they knew who he was. Back in the galley, Anya Patel stood frozen, her eyes wide. "What happened?" she asked in a whisper as Clara passed her. Clara didn't answer. She reached for a tray and began arranging drinks with more urgency than control. Her hands moved fast, almost mechanically, desperate to do something, anything, but her thoughts were spiraling. She had never been corrected like that in front of passengers. She had never been called out for what she always believed was just the job. Following instinct, enforcing standards, maintaining order. But now she saw it for what it really was. She hadn't been enforcing policy. She had been enforcing bias, and Justice Grant had made sure everyone in that cabin saw it for what it was, and they still had more than an hour left in the air. The silence around his seat had changed. Earlier, it had been the awkward kind, where everyone pretended not to notice. But now it was heavier, uncomfortable, like a truth had been spoken that no one could take back. He sat with the newspaper open, his eyes skimming the page, though he wasn't really reading. His thoughts were alert, focused on every movement, every shift in tone. He was not a man who sought attention, but he had lived long enough to know. Sometimes you had to speak, or the silence would say the wrong thing for you. Clara's apology, if you could even call it that, hadn't been born of understanding. It had come from fear, not regret over what she'd done, but fear over who he turned out to be. Across the aisle, Reed Maher glanced again, hesitated, then leaned slightly forward. "Sir," he said quietly, "if you don't mind me saying, I saw what happened earlier. I should have said something. I didn't. And I'm sorry." Ellison turned his head to him, calm and composed. "It's easier to stay quiet," he said, "until silence starts to sound like agreement." Reed nodded slowly, eyes downcast. "You're right. I should have known better." Ellison offered a small nod, then turned back to his paper. The conversation ended there, but the moment lingered. The others in the cabin had heard it too. No one else spoke, but the air had changed. A quiet shame settled among them. Back in the galley, Clara stood at the counter, pouring drinks with stiff hands. She carefully set a glass of chilled sparkling water and a small bowl of almonds onto a tray. Her hands trembled slightly, her eyes flicking toward Anya Patel, who was still watching her in silence. "I need to take this myself," Clara Maddox muttered, her voice taut. Anya hesitated. "Are you sure? I can do it." "No," Clara cut in quickly. "It has to be me." Tray in hand, she walked slowly down the aisle. Each step felt heavier than the last. For years, she had moved through first class like she commanded the space. But today, the power didn't belong to her. It clung to someone else. The air itself had shifted. As she neared Justice Ellison Grant's row, she straightened her back and forced a smile. "Would you care for something to drink, Mr. Grant? Sparkling water? Or something else?" He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his voice was calm, unhurried. "That's fine." She set the tray gently on his table, careful not to spill anything, her hand steadied only by sheer will. "If there's anything else you need," she said quietly, "please let me know." Ellison didn't touch the glass right away. He simply stared at it. Then slowly, his eyes rose to meet hers. "You didn't offer me anything when I first sat down," he said, his voice so low it felt more like a breeze than a statement. Clara froze. I was attending to other passengers," she replied, voice shaky. "But not all of them," he said, "only the ones you believed belonged here." Her face flushed, her throat tightened. She tried to find something, anything to say. But the words wouldn't come. Her mouth opened, closed again. Ellison didn't push the conversation further. He didn't need to. The silence between them now spoke louder than anything else. He picked up the glass, took a measured sip, and never broke eye contact. Clara turned away and walked back down the aisle, her face burning, her chest tight, and this time the eyes of the passengers, those eyes she had ignored so many times before, were locked on her. But they weren't filled with admiration or familiarity. They were filled with quiet judgment, disbelief, disappointment. People who had flown with her for years, who had greeted her warmly in other cabins, now looked at her like they didn't recognize her at all. She ducked into the galley, almost colliding with Anya. "What did he say?" Anya asked softly. Clara didn't answer. She stood with her back against the galley wall, breathing harder than she should have. Everything was unraveling. Her control, her confidence, the practiced mask she wore on every flight. It was cracking, and she could do nothing to stop it. In the cockpit, the captain reached for the in-flight phone. He dialed the number to ground operations. "This is flight NB 4842, he said, voice calm and even. "We've passed cruising altitude. ETA is just over an hour. Begin arrival prep." There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end replied, "Copy, Captain. Mr. Wells has requested a full debrief upon landing. Security will meet the aircraft at the gate. One crew member will be pulled for questioning." The captain didn't ask who. He already knew. "Understood," he replied. "We'll be ready." And with that, the final hour of the flight began. High above the clouds, but with a storm waiting just beyond the runway. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane settled into cruising altitude. But the tension? That remained sharp, taut, unshaken. Ellison sat quietly in his seat, sipping from the glass in front of him. The sparkling water was crisp, cool, but he wasn't savoring the drink. He was sitting in the quiet and letting others feel it, He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded attention. But now no one could look away. Behind the warm towels and forced smiles of first class, something real had surfaced, and no one knew what to do with it. 2 rows back, a woman named Layla Vance, dressed in a tailored slate-gray pantsuit, sat with a laptop open in front of her. She had been watching everything from the beginning. She had told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. But now she couldn't even focus. The words on her screen blurred. The numbers and charts meant nothing. She closed the laptop slowly, leaned back in her seat, and stared at the ceiling. Back in the galley, Clara stood still. She hadn't moved in 10 minutes. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, pretending to review a laminated checklist. Anya hovered a few steps away, pretending to count sugar packets. After several long moments, Anya finally spoke. "You should sit down," she said gently. "You don't look well." "I'm fine," Clara snapped, harsher than intended. "No, you're not," Anya replied, her tone still soft. "You haven't moved in 10 minutes. Clara clenched her jaw. "You think I did something wrong, don't you?" Anya hesitated before answering. "I think you judged too fast." Clara turned sharply, her eyes flashing. "You don't know what it's like. Every day, people try to sneak into seats they didn't pay for. I've seen it happen too many times." Anya's voice was quieter but firmer. That wasn't today. Those 5 words settled into the space between them like a stone dropping into water. Meanwhile, in seat 2A, Justice Ellison Grant leaned back slightly and picked up his phone again. Another message had arrived from Darren Wells. "Security team is briefed. You won't need to speak. Just stay seated after landing." Ellison tapped a short reply. "Understood." A new message buzzed on Justice Ellison Grant's phone. "Understood." She apologized publicly. He stared at the screen. Then another message followed almost instantly. "Apology is not accountability. She'll answer to the board." Ellison looked at the screen for a long moment, then slowly placed the phone down on the tray. He wasn't seeking revenge. That had never been his aim, but he had spent a lifetime watching people in power slip past consequences with a well-timed smile or a carefully worded report. This time, he wasn't going to let it slide, not when the harm hid behind professionalism and a polished uniform. Across the aisle, Reed Marr kept shifting in his seat. The guilt from earlier clung to him like static. Finally, he cleared his throat and leaned a bit closer. "Sir," he said, voice low but genuine, "I just want to say again, I'm sorry. For staying quiet, for letting her speak to you that way." Ellison turned to face him, his gaze level and calm. "You said something now? That matters." Reed exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly. "I've seen this sort of thing before, not always this obvious, but the way you responded, you didn't raise your voice. You didn't even flinch. That shook people. I think that's why no one could look away." Ellison didn't smile, but his voice softened. "The louder you speak, the easier it is for people to tune you out." He glanced toward the aisle, the curtain separating first class from the rest of the aircraft. Back there, a different world flew. No white linen napkins, no names remembered, no assumptions of status. He had sat in those rows more times than he could count. And he knew what happened today wasn't rare. It was just more visible. Suddenly, the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent in approximately 45 minutes. Please remain in your seats. Our crew will be making one final service round shortly. Thank you for flying with us." Back in the galley, Clara Maddox flinched at the sound of the announcement. It jarred her back into motion. She reached for a fresh tray, cups, sealed bottles of water, snacks, napkins. Her hands moved on autopilot, but the calm rhythm she had once mastered was gone. Each motion felt awkward, clumsy. Her thoughts hummed louder than the engine noise. She had always believed she was good at her job, efficient, confident, firm when needed. She followed procedure, or so she had told herself. But now she couldn't stop seeing his eyes, not angry, not vengeful, just disappointed. And that kind of look made a person feel small, without a word being said. She turned toward the aisle, ready to begin the last round of service. Then she hesitated. She didn't know if she could walk past him again, but she had to. Because the real landing hadn't happened yet, and what was waiting for her at the gate would be harder to face than anything she'd said at 30,000 feet. The tray felt heavier than ever. She walked slowly down the aisle, her back straight, her smile tight like a poorly pinned badge. The practiced grace of her service now felt like theater. She had made this walk down countless aisles on countless flights, but never like this. Not with the weight of shame pressing against her with every step, like a second uniform she couldn't take off. Every row she passed drew her closer to the beginning, the moment she'd seen a man in a plain coat with a first-class ticket and decided, without cause, that he didn't belong. Now, here she was, walking back to that same man, tray in hand, eyes all around her. Only this time, they weren't watching him. They were watching her. She reached Ellison's row and paused. He didn't look up. He was reading again, or at least pretending to. The newspaper rested neatly in his lap. His body relaxed, but his presence filled the space like quiet thunder. Clara cleared her throat. "Would you like another drink, Mr. Grant? We have freshly brewed coffee, orange juice. Anything else you might prefer?" He didn't respond at first. Then slowly, he looked up. His expression was calm, but there was nothing indifferent about it. His gaze was direct, penetrating, as if he could see right through the veneer of her courtesy. "Now you're offering?" he asked, his voice soft. Clara's throat constricted. "I apologize for earlier," she said, "truly." He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, taut and brittle. Then, with a slight nod, he said, "Black coffee." Clara nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and turned to pour it from the thermos on her tray. Her hands trembled again. She fought to keep them steady as she poured, careful not to spill a single drop. She placed the cup on the tray table in front of him and gently set down a folded napkin beside it. "Thank you," Ellison said. 2 words. Simple, but not the kind that brought her relief. Not today. She moved on down the aisle, tray in hand, heart still thudding. And behind her, first-class passengers turned their heads again. But not toward him. Toward her. As Clara Maddox moved briskly down the aisle, her hands tight on the now empty tray, she could feel the whispers beginning again. But this time, they weren't about Justice Ellison Grant. They were about her. Back in the galley, Anya Patel stood near the counter, arms crossed, watching Clara return. Her face was unreadable. "I gave him the coffee," Clara murmured, setting the tray down. "That's not going to fix this," Anya replied softly. Clara didn't answer. She didn't know how. For the first time in her career, she was out of responses, out of shields, out of excuses. Meanwhile, Ellison took a slow sip from the black coffee, letting its warmth settle into his chest. He turned his gaze toward the window. Below, the clouds drifted in slow, sweeping layers. The descent had begun quietly, though no announcement had come yet. He tapped his phone awake and checked the latest message from Darren Wells. "Security is in position. Executive team will meet us at the jet bridge. You won't need to speak. Just remain seated." Ellison typed back, "Copy. Keep it quiet." Darren responded instantly, "No scene." But it won't be forgotten. Ellison locked the screen and set the phone down again. He wasn't trying to create drama. He wasn't looking to embarrass Clara Maddox. He wanted something more difficult, Accountability, a sign that the people behind the uniforms, the policies, the protocols were no longer immune to the consequences of their choices. 2 rows behind him, Layla Vance finally found her voice. She leaned forward, speaking gently, just enough for him to hear. "Sir, if I may, thank you for how you handled it." Ellison turned slightly toward her, his brow raised. "Handled what?" "The way she treated you," Layla said. "The way you responded. It showed people something." He tilted his head. "And what was that?" "That you didn't need to raise your voice to show power." There was a long pause. Then, thoughtfully, he replied, "Sometimes the loudest thing in the room is how you choose to stay calm." Layla smiled faintly. "Well, at least a few of us noticed." Ellison turned back to the window. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Below, city grids began to form, intersecting highways stretching toward the horizon. Airport lights blinked faintly in the distance. And up here, above it all, a quiet reckoning had already begun to descend. In the galley, Clara stood at the counter, gripping its edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The usual sounds of clinking trays and quiet crew chatter were gone. Even Anya, usually light-hearted, hadn't cracked a smile in nearly an hour. The silence had spread through every corner of the plane like a fog. Clara's thoughts ran wild, looping through every moment. The apology, the coffee, the forced pleasantries. None of it had shifted how the cabin looked at her now. The same passengers who used to greet her warmly, who once called her by name, now offered long, sideways glances. They weren't angry, not openly, but the quiet judgment in their eyes said everything. She knew what they were thinking. They'd seen enough. They understood what happened. She had judged a man, questioned him, humiliated him, not because he was rude, disruptive, or out of line, but because he didn't look like what she expected from Seat 2A. And now every second of that choice was chasing her. "I've never seen you like this," Anya said quietly, breaking the silence. Clara didn't respond. She kept her hands braced against the counter, trying to stay upright. "Because I've never been in a position like this," she said eventually, her voice hoarse. Anya hesitated, then offered gently, "Maybe it's not the position. Maybe it's the choice." Clara turned her head slowly. "What's that supposed to mean? You chose to stop him. You chose to question him. No one told you to. That came from you." The words struck deeper than Anya probably meant them to, but she didn't take them back. Clara opened her mouth, ready to push back, to defend herself with all the usual lines. "I was following protocol. It didn't feel right. I've seen people cheat the system, but even as the excuses rose, they sounded hollow. Even to her, her shoulders slumped slightly. She lowered her eyes. "I didn't think it would turn into this." "You didn't think it mattered," Anya replied softly, and that, Clara knew, was the truth. A sudden announcement from the cockpit broke through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now on final approach. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened, tray tables are upright, and all personal items are stowed. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The words echoed like a signal, not just of descent, but of confrontation. Clara stepped into the aisle to begin her final cabin check. Her steps were slower now, each one feeling like she was dragging invisible weights behind her. She checked seat belts, nodded at passengers, avoided eye contact, and when she reached Ellison's row, she paused. His belt was already fastened. He didn't look at her. "We'll be landing in about 10 minutes, she said softly. "Let me know if there's anything you need." He gave no response, and that silence, it said enough. Clara Maddox stood beside seat 2A, waiting just for a moment. For something. Forgiveness, maybe. A look, a word, a signal that what she had said or done had started to mend the tear she had caused. But Justice Ellison Grant gave no reply, so she turned and walked away. Back in his seat, Ellison kept his gaze steady on the skyline out his window. The airport was in view now, rows of gates, distant service trucks, blinking runway lights. The plane dipped gently as it lined up for landing. The wheels beneath them rumbled softly in preparation. Ellison picked up his phone one last time and checked the latest message from Darren Wells. Executive team and security are waiting at the gate. Her badge will be pulled before passengers disembark. Quietly. No delays. He stared at the screen, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, just quiet acceptance. Not long ago he might have let it go, might have chalked it up to one more moment in a lifetime of being misjudged, but not today. Today he had chosen to speak, not just for himself, but for every person who had never been able to. Behind him, the cabin was eerily still. Some passengers sat with their eyes closed, pretending to rest. Others stared blankly at seat backs. No one was truly at ease. They were all waiting for what would happen the moment the plane came to a stop. As the aircraft descended, its wheels lowered with a soft mechanical groan. The final approach had begun. Up front, Clara stood near the galley curtain, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her heart pounded harder with every passing second, loud enough that she was sure someone could hear it. She had never feared a landing before, but this time the runway didn't signal the end of a shift. It marked the start of something she couldn't avoid. The plane touched down with a soft thud, the wheels catching the asphalt. A low vibration moved through the cabin floor. Outside, the world blurred into streaks. Runway lights, terminal buildings, stationary vehicles. Inside, there was no applause, no seatbelt clicks, no casual chatter about connections or luggage. This landing was different. Too quiet. Clara stood motionless at the front of the cabin, her face composed but pale, her breathing shallow. One hand pressed lightly against the cabin wall to steady herself. Her thoughts weren't on announcements or cabin safety. They were on the conversation in the cockpit, on the man seated quietly behind her, on the message she knew had traveled far above her authority, the kind of message that didn't go through reports or emails, the kind that ended careers. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, calm and practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. Local time is 3:47 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we've reached the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with North Bay Air. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one moved. Just outside the jet bridge, a sleek black sedan waited behind the glass. Beside it stood two executives in sharp suits and a uniformed airport security officer. No one else lingered nearby. The aircraft door remained closed. Clara hadn't received clearance to begin disembarkation in first class. Ellison Grant remained seated, calm, upright, his cane resting beside his leg, his phone still in hand. He hadn't said a word since touchdown, and still his silence filled the entire cabin like a presence no one could ignore. The other passengers had stopped pretending. No one scrolled their phones. No one reached for bags. They were all waiting, too. Clara stepped toward the aircraft door, headset still in place, and pressed the call button. This is Flight NB442. We've landed. Awaiting clearance to open door 1. The voice on the other end didn't respond immediately. When it came, it was crisp and professional. Hold for instruction. Executives will board momentarily. Clara's mouth went dry. Executives. Plural. Her heart pounded harder now, echoing in her ears. She turned around slowly to face the first-class cabin. For the first time in all her years of flying, she didn't feel like the crew. She felt like a passenger, stuck in her own seat, unable to move, waiting for someone else to decide her fate. Then came a soft knock on the outside of the cabin door. Anya Patel opened it. 3 people stepped into the aircraft. First was Darren Wells, director of airline operations. He wore a dark gray suit and moved with quiet certainty. His expression was unreadable. Beside him was Imran Shah, head of crew training, clipboard in hand, and behind them, the airport security officer, standing tall but silent. The moment Darren stepped into the cabin, the atmosphere changed. Eyes lifted. Heads turned. Passengers watched without speaking. Darren didn't raise his voice, didn't scan the room. He moved forward with quiet purpose and stopped directly in front of Clara. She stood straight, hands folded, trying to keep herself composed even as her breath grew shallower. She had walked into countless cabins with confidence. But now she stood in this one, waiting to hear what came next. Clara swallowed hard, but managed to nod. "Yes, sir." As she turned to follow, Darren Wells spoke again, calmly but firmly. "Please hand your identification badge to Mr. Shah." Clara froze. Her badge. The word struck her like a sharp wind. Her hand reached slowly for the silver clip on her uniform. With fingers that trembled, she unclipped the badge she had worn for over a decade and handed it to Imran Shah. He didn't say a word. He simply placed it into his jacket pocket. The action was quiet, simple, but to Clara it felt like everything she had ever built, years of promotions, thousands of flight hours, had been taken from her in a single, silent exchange. She turned to walk behind the executives, her posture stiff, head bowed. As she passed down the aisle, she allowed herself a single glance toward Justice Ellison Grant. He was still seated, still composed, still watching, but not in judgment, not in anger, just watching. And somehow, that made it harder. Clara kept her head down as she passed row after row. Her feet moved slowly, her face flushed with a quiet shame. Not a single passenger spoke. Not one person looked away. No one offered sympathy. She was invisible now, but not in the way she used to be, when she moved with command and confidence. Now, she was invisible because the authority she once wielded had been stripped away. She stepped off the plane. Behind her, the cabin door closed with a soft, final click. But the silence that followed inside was deafening. Ellison remained seated, calm as ever, his cane resting beside his foot. The newspaper he had taken earlier hadn't moved. Not a page turned. Around him, the other passengers sat stiffly in their seats, their thoughts heavy. Not one of them had spoken up when Clara questioned him. Not one had intervened when she dismissed him in front of everyone. Now they sat in the wake of it all, realizing the weight of their silence. 2 rows behind, Layla Vance sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been en route to a business seminar, but the most important lesson she'd received wasn't on her laptop or in a PowerPoint. It had played out in front of her, and she had done nothing. Her chest ached with that truth. To her left, Reed Marr still sat nervously, his fingers tugging at the hem of his blazer. He had apologized earlier, but now even that felt hollow. A man like Ellison didn't need apologies. He needed people to stop letting this kind of thing happen. After several still minutes, a young gate agent stepped quietly onto the aircraft. Her voice was soft, respectful. "Mr. Grant," she said, "your car is ready. You're welcome to disembark now." Ellison didn't rush. He stood slowly, adjusting the strap of his leather bag and picking up his coat. With steady hands, he reached for his cane and rose with the quiet grace of a man who had faced much worse than turbulence. His posture was tall, his eyes steady. He walked forward down the aisle, not glancing once at the other passengers. But they watched him. Every single one of them watched as he passed. Not as someone who had simply been served a coffee late, but as someone who had shifted the very temperature of the cabin without raising his voice. His silence had revealed truths people didn't want to admit still lived here. Assumption, quiet bias, discrimination, cloaked in professionalism. When he stepped through the aircraft door, the air felt different, cleaner somehow, sharper. A quiet kind of clarity. Waiting just beyond the jet bridge was a sleek black sedan. A driver stood beside it, holding the door open. Nearby, Darren Wells was already on the phone, nodding respectfully as Ellison approached. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Ellison stepped into the back seat, placed his cane beside him, and the door closed softly behind him. Inside the aircraft, the remaining passengers finally began to move, but slowly, cautiously. There was no rush to the aisle like on most flights. No impatient chatter, no clamor for overhead bins. There was only quiet, an uncomfortable, reflective quiet. A few eyes were wet, some faces were still flushed with guilt. Layla stood and reached for her bag in the overhead compartment. As she waited for the line to inch forward, she glanced toward the front of the cabin where Anya Patel now stood, preparing to thank each passenger as they exited. Was she fired? Layla asked gently. Anya hesitated. She chose her words carefully. No one said the word, she replied, but they didn't need to. Anya Patel paused, weighing her words carefully. No one said the word, she repeated, but they didn't need to. Layla Vance gave a small, solemn nod. I hope she thinks about what she did. She will, Anya replied, her voice steady but quiet. Farther down the aisle, Reed Marr helped an elderly woman lift her bag from the overhead bin. It wasn't much, but in that moment, he needed to do something. Anything. Something to feel useful. But deep down, he knew the truth. Kindness in the final minutes didn't erase the silence in the beginning. One by one, passengers exited the aircraft, each with a carry-on in hand and something heavier in their minds. A memory, a reckoning, a choice they had made or failed to make. Outside, the black sedan pulled away from the gate with Justice Ellison Grant, seated quietly in the back. He watched through the tinted window as the airport terminals drifted past. His phone buzzed beside him. It was from Victor Saleh. Board heard everything. Policy review scheduled this week. You started something bigger than one flight. Ellison stared at the screen. He didn't reply right away. He didn't need to, because he understood what Victor meant. This was never about the seat, or the coffee, or even the lack of an apology. It was about the rules people follow when they think no one's watching. It was about the split-second judgments people make when they don't expect to be questioned. And it was about the quiet power of one voice seated in 2A, choosing not to disappear. By the time the sedan exited the airport grounds, the ripple of that flight had already reached the glass towers of North Bay Air's downtown executive offices. The news didn't arrive with headlines, but it traveled fast. From the flight report to department heads, from internal emails to group chats, from whispers in lounges to the boardroom. Did you hear what happened on flight NB442? The story came with clarity. A senior flight attendant had challenged a first-class passenger's right to be there, not because of protocol, but because of perception. A man who not only belonged in first class, but who also owned a stake in the airline itself had been dismissed, judged, and humiliated. And the fallout wasn't going to be a form letter. In a quiet, glass-lined conference room, 6 senior executives sat around a long table. At the head sat Zara Mirani, Vice President of Corporate Affairs. Her fingers were interlaced. Her expression was sharp as she read the printed flight report. To her left sat Rehan Ali, Director of Crew Management, and Darren Wells, fresh from the airport. No one spoke at first. The silence was purposeful. Finally, Zara looked up. So, we had a senior crew member stop a first-class passenger, demand additional ID, delay his boarding, deny him service, and only after realizing who he was, offer a public apology. Darren nodded once. That's correct. She didn't recognize him? Rehan asked. Apparently not, Darren said. She claimed it was a manifest discrepancy. It wasn't. His name was on the list. He was cleared before doors opened. Zara leaned back slowly in her chair. This isn't about a ticket. No, Darren replied. It's about how she saw him and what she assumed. Across the table, Amin Khoury, head of legal compliance, closed his folder quietly. No formal complaint filed, he noted. Nothing through legal. No press. No statements. Zara turned to Darren again. Do you think he will go public? Darren shook his head. I don't think he has to. What happened on that flight already spoke for itself. And the passengers saw it. Word will spread. Zara tapped her pen against the table. Once. Twice. Slowly. We cannot afford to let this go unanswered, she said, not quietly, not with a half-hearted memo. She stood, walked to the whiteboard, and uncapped a marker. In thick, bold letters, she wrote, Policy Review Training Overhaul, Public Commitment. Then she underlined each word with precision. We review all in-flight service protocols. We implement bias awareness training. And we issue a public statement, general, not personal, but clear. This company does not tolerate discrimination. Not in form, not in tone, not in assumption. Darren nodded slowly. And Clara Maddox? Zara asked. She's suspended. Effective immediately, Rehan replied. Her employment will be reviewed following a formal hearing. She's been with us 14 years, said Rehan Singh, VP of Human Resources. She'll argue it was a judgment call, that she followed her instincts. Zara turned to face him, expression cool. Then she can explain why she didn't stop the man in business class with sneakers and headphones, or the man with no carry-on, or the woman who walked past without showing her ID. No one responded. They didn't have to, because the answer was already known. Meanwhile, in the quiet of a residential street, the black sedan eased to a stop outside a modest house framed by trimmed hedges and soft porch light. The engine hummed, then stilled. Ellison Grant didn't open the door right away. He reached for his phone again and read Victor's message one more time. You started something bigger than one flight. This time, Ellison typed back. Good. It was time. He stepped out of the car, cane in hand, and walked slowly toward his front door. The air smelled faintly of fresh rain. A cool breeze moved through the trees and brushed against Justice Ellison Grant's face. He paused for a moment on the porch, looking up at the sky. Just above, a faint trail of clouds marked where his flight had passed an hour before. He didn't feel triumphant, not proud, not angry, just tired. Tired of days like this, of walking into rooms and having to carry his dignity like a shield. Of being seen through, not for who he was, but for who people decided he couldn't be. And yet, something in him was still steady. Because today, silence hadn't won. Today, something had cracked open. And on the other side of that silence, people had finally heard it. 2 days later, North Bay Air released a quiet press statement on its website. No headlines, no flashing banners, just a simple, carefully worded message from the communications department. We are reviewing our current in-flight service procedures after a recent internal matter. The company remains committed to ensuring all passengers, regardless of appearance or background, are treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. We are actively updating crew training programs with renewed emphasis on equity, accountability, and unbiased service. We recognize the work of those who uphold our values daily and acknowledge there is still more to be done. The flight wasn't named. Ellison Grant wasn't named. But for those who had been on board NB 442, there was no confusion. Inside his study, Ellison sat at his desk, the soft ticking of a large clock marking the stillness of the room. A small cup of tea sat beside him, cold now, untouched. He read the statement 3 times, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. He saw clearly what wasn't being said. This wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a company coming face to face with its own discomfort, acknowledging at last that silence wasn't safe anymore, that something had shifted. Even that, Ellison knew, was progress, because silence had always been the system's strongest hiding place, and now silence was beginning to crack. Across the room, a large manila envelope rested on the edge of his table. Inside, a formal invitation from the airline's board. They asked him to attend a private policy review meeting as a shareholder. It wasn't labeled a disciplinary panel. No one used those words, but Ellison knew they were trying to show him something, that it mattered, that it wouldn't be forgotten, that change wasn't going to be buried under polite avoidance. He didn't respond to the letter right away. Across the city, Clara Maddox sat alone on a narrow bench outside Human Resources. She wore a navy blouse and plain slacks, clothes she hadn't worn since her earliest days at the airline, when she was just another rookie trying to prove herself. Her badge was gone, her uniform turned in, her control stripped away. She stared at the floor tiles, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The last few days had been a blur. Phone calls, meetings, statements. She had gone through the motions like clockwork. She had only cried once, in her car, right after giving up her badge. Not because she had been caught, but because for the first time she had been forced to see herself through someone else's eyes. And what she saw, how quickly she'd assumed, how cold her voice had sounded, shook something deep in her. She remembered his face, Ellison Grant. Not angry, not triumphant, just disappointed. And that expression stayed with her far more than any scolding could have. Inside the HR conference room, a disciplinary panel sat waiting. Her file lay open on the table, 14 years of service, awards, glowing evaluations. But right beside them, the incident report from Flight NB-4342, the statements from Anya Patel, Reed Mayer, Layla Vance, and several others. None of them had called for punishment, but all had told the truth. He was calm. She was dismissive. It wasn't about ID. She judged him before he said a word. And the one that hit hardest, Anya's words, "Clara is good at her job." But that day, she wasn't leading. She was guarding a gate, and she shut the wrong one. Clara had read that line over and over, because she knew it was true. Back at his home, Ellison's phone buzzed on the desk. It was from Darren Wells. Training overhaul approved. First session is next week. You've been invited as keynote. Ellison stared at the message for a long moment. He hadn't asked for this role. He didn't want to be a symbol, but maybe this wasn't about being a symbol at all. Maybe it was about making sure the next man in seat 2A didn't have to carry a burden that wasn't his to begin with. He typed a short reply, "I'll be there." Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out across the quiet street. Golden light filtered through the trees. The sky was clear. There was no podium, no spotlight, just movement. Forward. And this time, it wouldn't stop at the runway. The training hall filled slowly. Cabin leads, trainers, and a few newly promoted team leaders entered with a quiet tension. Most didn't speak much. Some looked curious, others uneasy. A few had only heard whispers about what had happened on NB-442, but some, they knew every detail and hadn't said a word outside their team chats. Today, though, was different. This wasn't a routine workshop. The chairs were arranged in precise rows facing a raised platform. At the front, a plain wooden podium stood beneath a large screen bearing the North Bay Air logo, and underneath that logo, 3 bold black words: dignity, equality, accountability. There were no flashy intro videos, no upbeat welcome music, only the soft shuffling of shoes and murmured greetings as attendees filed in, glancing occasionally toward the empty podium. In the front row, Darren Wells sat with a folder open in his lap, reviewing his notes for the brief introduction he would give. But his focus kept drifting to the back of the room. He was waiting. A moment later, Anya Patel stepped in quietly, her uniform crisp, a small notebook in hand. She slipped into a seat at the end of the third row. Clara Maddox was not in attendance. Her case remained under formal review. The disciplinary panel had delayed any final decision until after this session. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. The back doors opened. Justice Ellison Grant entered. He wore a dark gray blazer, no tie, a simple watch, nothing showy. But the effect was immediate. He didn't walk like someone seeking attention. He walked like a man with something to say and nothing to prove. As he passed each row, people stood, not because they were told to, but because it felt right. Ellison gave a polite nod in return and made his way to the front. He shook hands with Darren, no words exchanged, because their conversation had started long before this day. Darren stepped aside, and Ellison stepped behind the podium. No microphone adjustments, no rustling of papers. He didn't need notes. He simply looked out at the faces before him, some open, some guarded, many uncertain. Then, in his calm and steady voice, he began, "I wasn't supposed to speak today. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want a spotlight or a stage. I just wanted to fly home quietly, like anyone else." The room was still. He continued, "But on that flight, someone looked at me and made a decision, not based on my name or my seat, but on what I looked like, what I wore, the color of my skin." He paused, letting the silence stretch. That decision wasn't small. It wasn't just about a boarding pass or an ID. It was about whether I was seen as someone who belonged. His words landed heavily. And what was worse than that decision was how everyone around it stayed quiet, not because they agreed, but because silence is easier. A few heads dropped. Ellison's voice never rose, but it held weight. I've spent decades in rooms like this. Courtrooms, boardrooms, classrooms, and I've learned that silence is the strongest shield injustice has. When good people say nothing, bad choices take root. He looked toward the back of the room where a few senior trainers sat, but it doesn't have to stay that way. He stepped out from behind the podium, his cane tapping lightly on the floor as he walked. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm not here to end careers. What happened on that flight didn't start with one person. It started with a culture, a habit, a system that lets quiet bias hide behind procedure." He stopped near the edge of the stage. "We train our crews to memorize 104 safety codes, to handle turbulence, fires, and emergencies mid-air. If we can do that, then we can train them to see bias in their own eyes, to treat every person in every seat as someone who matters." He scanned the room again. This isn't about slogans or brochure photos. It's about the difference between being allowed to board and being welcomed, between being cleared and being respected. Then, in a voice that was soft but filled with unshakable resolve, "If this company truly wants to fly above the clouds, then it must first stand firmly on the ground, with both feet planted in fairness." He paused, then gave a quiet nod and returned to his seat. No one moved. No one clapped at first. Then a single pair of hands began to applaud, then another and another, until the room echoed, not with loud celebration, but with steady, meaningful recognition. The kind that didn't praise a speaker. It honored a shift, a beginning. Justice Ellison Grant sat back down, calm once more. His cane rested across his knees, his gaze steady. And as North Bay Air's first anti-bias training session officially began, a quiet truth settled into the hearts of everyone present. The flight had ended, but the journey had only just begun. A month had passed, and what happened aboard Flight NB442 was no longer a scandal. It wasn't a headline. It had become something else entirely, A case study, passed from training rooms to HR seminars, whispered in break rooms, then slowly spoken aloud in team huddles and leadership meetings. At first, crew members were hesitant to mention it, unsure if it was safe to ask questions. But then, something shifted. Voices, once cautious, began speaking more openly. Cabin staff from regional hubs, junior attendants from smaller routes, even supervisors from departments that rarely engaged with passengers began asking the same thing. What really happened on that flight? And, more importantly, what are we doing to make sure it never happens again? The answer didn't come from a flashy video, not from a corporate statement. It came through something quieter, something stronger, a shift, not loud, but lasting. Flight attendants were no longer just trained in service. They were taught awareness. Gate agents were told to match not just names with IDs, but procedures with empathy. And new hire orientation began, including a simple, powerful question. Before you decide someone doesn't belong, ask yourself why you believe that. For the first time in its history, North Bay Air's training division invited a retired federal judge to review their internal code of conduct. Justice Ellison Grant never once mentioned Clara Maddox by name. He didn't have to, because it wasn't about punishment. It was about reflection. And weeks later, reflection arrived in the form of a quietly sealed letter. Typed. Delivered by hand. Inside were the words Clara hadn't been able to say aloud. I looked at you and saw a question mark, a mistake, something that didn't fit. And that's my failure, not yours. I thought I was protecting the cabin. But really, I was protecting my assumptions. I told myself I was following protocol, but I was following fear. I thought you were in the wrong seat. But the truth is, I was the one who needed to move. Ellison read the letter alone in his study, then folded it gently and placed it in a drawer. He didn't reply. He didn't need to, because some answers don't live in words. They live in change. Across the city, in a glass-paneled boardroom, the executive team gathered for their quarterly review. Zara Mirani stood at the front of the room. Her first slide showed a graph. Crew satisfaction was up, passenger complaints were down. But it was the last slide that carried the most weight, a list of passenger names. Each one had reported being treated with unusual care, kindness, and professionalism, unprompted, untrained. It wasn't just policy, it was real change. In the corner of the screen, beneath the names, a quiet note had been added in small gray text, NB 442, standard, rewritten. Back at home, Ellison Grant sat on his back porch, wrapped in a sweater. The late breeze carried soft notes of jasmine from the edge of his yard. The city murmured in the distance. Birds traced lazy arcs across the evening sky. His phone buzzed beside him. A message from Darren Wells. Would you consider joining the permanent board for training oversight? Ellison stared at the screen, then smiled faintly. He typed back, let me think about it, because titles didn't interest him anymore. He had spent decades behind a bench, handing down decisions that shaped lives. Now, all he wanted was to live his own life with the dignity he had always carried, and to make sure that dignity wasn't a privilege for some, but a standard for all. Inside his home, on a small table, sat a framed photo. Ellison standing at North Bay headquarters, surrounded by a new class of trainees. Some young, some older, every background, every story. Some smiling, some still learning, but all of them listening. The next generation, the next flight. And maybe the next Ellison, walking down a jet bridge, quiet, thoughtful, dignified, who would never be stopped at the door again. Because someone, somewhere, had already changed what that door meant, not with noise, but with truth. And it all began with a man in seat 2A who chose not to walk away quietly, but to stay seated until the world stood up.